In December of 2022, I decided to build myself a computer desk. The desk I had at work was pretty comfortable, but my home desk was an old kitchen table. Now, because I liked my work desk so much, I decided my new desk would be very similar. Unfortunately, I missed out on some key early footage, so for the sake of the video, I spent, 7 hours recreating and animating my desk in 3D. Now, I hope this makes sense. For the desktop, the layers are as shown. Top layer, 3/4 inch by 4 foot by 8 foot, grade C birch plywood. The bottom layer is 3/4 inch by 4 foot by 8 foot, BCX plywood. Between the two sheets, I have prongs T-nuts. That way the flange screws have something to thread into. The layers will be glued and screwed together to form a 1.5 inch thick slab. Looking at the bottom face of the BCX panel, I sketched out the profile of my desktop. Next, I sketched out the lines for the flange locations. Then I drilled the holes for the flanges and T-nuts using a 1/4 inch drill bit. Finally, I drew a bunch of intersecting lines to use as guides for the screws I will use to clamp the two panels together. Flip the panel over and install the T-nuts. Flip it back and install the flanges. Okay, back to reality. I drew the dots on there to mark the locations of the screws that I'll use to clamp the panels together. I was worried about the cap screws pushing up against the birch layer, so I decided to drill clearance pockets. To keep things aligned, I added registration marks and clamped the panels together. Once the panels were clamped together, I tapped on every screw so it would create an indent in the birch layer. After all the indents were made, I removed the lower panel and I went through and center punched every indent. I then finished up by drilling the new clearance pockets with a countersink bit. I then flipped the panel back over, aligned it, and then started drilling all of my clamp holes with a countersink drill bit. Time to glue. I separated the panels and started applying the glue with a body filler applicator. It took forever to apply the glue, and I ended up using a little more than a container. If I remember correctly, it was Titebond 3. After glue, I flipped the panel back over, aligned, and started screwing everything in place. Here are the 10-foot pipes loaded on the trailer. I'll be cutting all the pipe with my Evolution miter saw. And here are the first cuts. After rearranging a bit, it's time to figure out the horizontal cross members. Back when I marked my flange locations, I started deviating from my original plan. Now my cross members are different lengths than originally intended. I had attempted to cope the pipes with my drill press and a hole saw. I first started with this side and slowly plunged the saw into the pipe. After about 10 minutes, I made it through. But it didn't line up right and is not symmetrical. I got that side done and switched over to the other side. That didn't go so well. I got impatient and the saw kept binding and a bunch of teeth fell out, so I tried another option. I found this website called blocklayer.com, and they have this pipe coping / notching calculator. You just enter the outer and inner diameter of both tubes, what angle you want to cut at, and it generates a template. After finding a good template, I needed to come up with a quick jig to clock the copes. Once I had one end of the pipe coped, I could push it up against the table leg to lock its rotation. To keep the pipe from hitting the flange, I used a wood block as a spacer. On the other end of the pipe, I supported it using a scrap piece of tube steel, which acted as a V-block. By opening or closing the V, I was able to set the height to match the wood block. I checked the clock of the template, with the square by taking measurements on both sides until they matched up. Then I go in and trace the profile. Here's some more info on the template. I drew centerline marks at the center of every arc on the template for clocking purposes. When the opposite marks measure the same distance from the table, everything is clocked correctly. So I'll measure this side, then I'll measure this side, then I'll verify before tracing the profile. To cut the copes, I'm going to be using the angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. Now when I shot the video, I was making a few angle cuts and then notching out little teeth in an attempt to follow the contour of the template perfectly. That got old real quick. It took forever and I didn't think it was worth the time, especially since I'd be filling everything in with weld anyway. After a few notches, I started bringing my first angle cuts all the way to the center of the cope, or the arc. Next, I'll be applying a bevel to the cope. For this example, the closest distance between table legs is 15.188, or 15 3/16. But now I need to figure out how much extra material will be required for the copes. To do this, I just measured the template and doubled up that number. This ended up being 1/4 inch, so I would need to add a 1/2 inch to my overall length. That brings my total pipe length to 15.688. Once the cuts are made, I will do a dry fit. I used 2x4s as spacers to locate the bars. The spacers for the bars nearest the table are set at 3.5 inches. The spacers for the bars nearest the floor are set at 4.25 inches. Once I determine the location for the bar, I'll use my clamps to temporarily hold it in place. For good weld penetration, you're going to need a clean surface. Once the bars are in place, I'll mark out the areas that need to be cleaned up. I'll then go in and clean everything that needs cleaning. And there you have it, prepped and ready. Only a few more to do and I can start welding. Before I continue, I noticed that I need to square up my table legs. I've already checked the middle leg and it seems to be pretty square going this way. Going this way, I'll force them straight using the horizontal pipes. If I move the camera back and forth, you can see what I'm talking about. I think the reason they're out of square is due to the flanges. So all I should need to do is rotate the flanges 90 degrees. The leg on one end seems to be out of square by about a 1/2 inch. If I move down to the middle leg, it's not perfect, but I think that's about as good as it's going to get. So I'm just going to go with it. Now I'll need to figure out which direction is most square to the table. This side seems to be the most square. All I will need to do is rotate the flange counterclockwise by 90 degrees. I'll do this for the remaining flanges as well. Now that everything is all squared up, it sure looks a lot better. Alright, everything's cleaned up, the legs are straight, and I'm ready to start welding. Alright, I'll finish tacking. Looks pretty okay. I'm feeling pretty good about it. I need the leg weldments to be separate so the desk can be disassembled and reassembled somewhat easily. After giving it some thought, I decided I'd use a bolted connection. I'm going to use these tabs, which I've already cut out and beveled, and attach them to the legs right about here and here. Here is a quick sketch showing how everything will come together. A tab on each side, and the bar will need tabs of its own so everything can bolt right up. The bolt sizes were determined by whatever I could find in the workshop that actually matched. I've got these little heavy-duty adjustable leveling feet. I'll take this little flange and center it best I can and tack it in place. And I completely forgot about the shelf for the computer. I've screwed down a straight edge to act as a guide for the circular saw. I've also taped the lower part of the table where I'll be cutting. My circular saw doesn't have a fine-tooth blade on it, so I'm hoping that the tape will help alleviate some of the tear out. I've got this edge on the end and this long edge squared up now. Then I'll move on to this diagonal, and this diagonal, the flat, and the end. I was a little worried about cutting this corner with the circular saw. The plan was to cut up until a certain point and then finish the cut with a handsaw. I've screwed down the straight edge and I'm using my framing square as a stop to keep me from cutting too far. So all I need to do is push the saw and it'll stop right where I need it to. At this point, I started to worry a little bit about the weight of the triangular drop piece. And so I'm going to use the opposite side of the straight edge as a guide. That way I can remove most of the material before I make my final cut. So far so good. I've got this cut made and it goes all the way to the intersection. I've already marked out where I'll be putting my straight edge for the next cut. I've supported the bottom of the table and the finished side has been taped off, so hopefully everything will go well. Success! The corner is fairly clean. I'm okay with it. I can go and finish things up with the chisel. The edges seem to have held up. Looks like my tape was in the correct location. Now to chop off that end, flip it over, and do a dry fit. Not too bad. It's so cool when all the parts come together. And here I am sanding the edges so I can apply the edge banding. Yay, time for edge banding. Pre-glued. Iron on. Let's do it. I went ahead and completed all of the other edges so I could get some practice before doing it on camera. The instructions say to use a roller to apply the banding. And that would have been a great idea. But I must have missed that little note when I was buying supplies. Burning my fingers to apply the banding. That was my method of choice. Here's where I'm using the little trimming tool against the grain. Yes, I did get some tear out, and we'll look at all the flaws in a moment, but first, we sand. Here's the area I just applied the edge banding to. A lot of this tear out is due to the initial sawing, but some is due to cutting the edge banding. Over here, on the opposite end, is more tear out. And this little corner down here is messed up too. Some more saw tear out. I think this one was due to edge banding. This is really the only part I care about, and that's because I'll have to look at it on a regular basis. It's not perfect, but I'm okay with that. It's time for finishing. I'm starting off with some grain filler. Now, I made a lot of mistakes on this part. I also wasted a lot of materials, time, and energy. So, I'm just going to do a little montage for this. Rather than go into a bunch of detail, I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of everything that I had done during this part. When steel is welded, it tends to move a little bit. So once I removed the tabletop from the frame, the flange holes on the frame moved away from their original locations. I also think that the tabletop itself might have been bowed when I glued the two sheets together. So if you're doing this in the future, make sure both sheets of plywood are as flat as can be before you screw them together. Well, whatever happened, I needed to waller out the holes in the flanges in order to reinstall the tabletop. One last look at the underside before I sand it smooth. Here, the bottom of the table is sanded down to 150 grit. Due to the plywood grade, there are a lot of voids and splits, so I filled those in with an entire tube of filler. And here it is with the filler sanded down and some sanding sealer applied. Over here on the frame, I wiped it down with some acetone to help prep for paint. Now the plan is to paint it with 2 coats of black. I attempted to paint but ran out, so of course I had to run to the store again. Now at some point I realized I needed to install some mounting tabs for the side panel. I needed to find some material to make mounting tabs. After looking through my scrap, I found this old piece of framing square, and I think it'll work just fine. Cleaned up. And here's the frame after installing the side panel tabs. I also installed some flat bars so I could fasten the PC shelf to the frame. Moving on to the shelf and side panel. Dry fitting the shelf. Looks good. For the side panel, I'm going to use some water putty to fill in this large split, and then I'll dye both sides of the panel. This is the dye I'll be using. It's a leather dye, and I've seen some pretty neat projects where people have used it. I've got 1 coat of grain filler on the shelf. It seems to be fine like this, so I considered it done. For the sidewall, I've applied some water putty, but it's still drying at this point. I plan on sanding it down and then applying a single coat of grain filler. After that, I'll dye both sides black. Back on over to the frame again. I've got it painted, and I've attempted to wipe it down with a cotton cloth, which seemed to shine up the flat finish a little bit. Now this is mostly filler dialogue because I have no idea what to say at times like this. So let's go ahead and install a shelf. The shelf installs pretty easily, and I think it looks pretty good. After applying the grain filler to the side panel, it's time to sand and apply the dye. I attempted to apply the dye with a rag on the opposite side, but it seemed to waste a lot of dye. The included applicator was much more efficient. I settled on 2 coats. Now here's the side panel installed. Alright, now it's time to set the tabletop in place and see what I've done. Whew, that's got some weight to it. Now here's a repeat clip from the beginning of the video. Haha! Success! It is finally done! Oh my god, I think it took about 4 weeks to build the desk. And you know what? I'm pretty happy with it. At the time of this audio recording, it has been a little over a year since building the desk. So I can report that it has held up really well. I have experienced 0 issues with the desk at all. It is super sturdy, and I think it's going to last a really long time. Thanks for watching.